And let me now move into the second session for day two. The moderator for the session is Mr. J.L. Singh. Mr. J.L. Singh is a professional railway person who has the unusual distinction of having worked with the railways in every continent of the world. Last I checked, I think he missed Antarctica, but that may be for want of railway lines. Well, despite that very vast experience with the railways, Mr. J.L. Singh insists that he is primarily a rail enthusiast. So he has actually been doing what he loves to do. He is also the ever-energetic secretary of our society, the editor of our magazine, and a gentleman of many, many interests. For the second session of day two, I hand you over to Mr. J.L. Singh.
Thank you, Mayank. Anyway, welcome again to all rail lovers and fellow rail enthusiasts. The very fact that you are back after a long day yesterday is proof, if any is needed, of your passion for the railways. Today, of course, I have the great pleasure of introducing Arup Chatterjee, an associate professor of English at the Jindal Global Law School at Sonipat, very near New Delhi in India. A prolific writer, Arup is the author of the widely reviewed and acclaimed book, The Purveyors of Destiny, a cultural biography of the Indian Railways. His other writings include history, literature, culture, politics, a vast array of subjects. Arup's talk today will take you on a historic adventure through many junctions of India's hidden railway legends, with anecdotes from imperial politics, European and Indian accounts, the battlefronts of the Indian nationalist movement, Indian cinema, songs, advertisements, and much more in an ever-expanding cultural biography of the Indian Railways. So I will not come between you and Arup. So over to you, Mr. Arup Chatterjee. Arup, are you there?
Arup, please unmute.
Yeah, Arup is there.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, I'm sharing a screen on your Zoom pages. If you could see the screen, kindly let me know.
Yeah.
Yes, you can see it.
Very well. So I've been an admirer of Mr. Apoor Bahadur and Samit Roy Chaudhary and many others, including Mr. Singh and Mr. Singh. And I have been an avid admirer of the IRFCA page as well. I happen to be one of the relatively inexperienced speakers, I suppose, in this very esteemed conference. And my subject today is going to be a little different than what the other speakers have focused on. So we have a lot of information and a lot of very dense scholarship when it comes to the history of the Indian Railways. But my presentation today is going to tell us how to make sense of all that information. And my subject today is a Jungian hypothesis on the Indian Railways. Now, you all must be wondering what I mean by Jungian, and I'll come to it. But the central question that I'm trying to address here is what if railway iconography was studied like a dream? Now, this word iconography, let's not be thrown off by it. It simply means the study of icons. And icons can be of many kinds here. For example, the photograph on your left-hand side is an icon, and the railway engine of the DHR that we see on our screen is also an icon. And the people and the various commodities and all the artifacts and things and objects that we see in this picture are also icons. And we are almost always inevitably interpreting all these icons, and it's all going into an archive, a psychological archive, if you will. So my question today will be how to make sense of these icons that we see when we look at railway representations from Indian history. So let's cover the background first about what we mean by iconography and Jungian and so on. Now, Jungian comes from the word Jung, which is the surname of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who was born in 1875. And he was a student and colleague of Sigmund Freud, a very eminent Viennese psychoanalyst. And Carl Jung went a step ahead of Sigmund Freud and gave us very eminent concepts in psychology, such as the collective unconscious, the archetype, the shadow, and so on. Now, I'll be explaining to you what is meant by the collective unconscious and the archetype. But perhaps you might get a sense of what the collective unconscious, the archetype, and concepts like synchronicity are. If I told you that also in 1875, we have the birth of Sardar Patel and Jim Corbett, who are by no means related to Carl Jung, but somehow it seems as if that event in Indian history tends to have some bearing for people who are dealing with very discrete, diverse sources of information. Automatically, our minds tend to create some correlations. The second important thing that happened in 1875, especially from our perspective, was nearly 100 million pounds were invested in the Indian Guaranteed Railways. And this was despite the widespread famines in Deccan, Rajputana, and later in the Malwa regions. The Prince of Wales visited India for a grand imperial tour, and the Pullman carriages were formally introduced. So if I talk about synchronicity based on this slide, it appears to us as if there is some apparent historical connection between or correlation between the birth of Carl Jung, Sardar Patel, Jim Corbett, these 100 million pounds getting invested, the widespread famines, the Prince of Wales coming to India, and Pullman carriages being introduced. Of course, there is no real correlation, but this is what it seems to us. And this is what our minds tend to construct as a psychological narrative. Now, the Jungian hypothesis, which this paper, this presentation is proposing today, is based on, like I said, a study of icons. On your right-hand side, you have some very prominent icons, the rupee sign or symbol, the switch off and switch on symbol. On the right-hand side bottom is the Chinese yin and yang, or the Tajitu, which talks about which signifies the cycles of life. And on the left bottom is the copyright symbol. So if we take iconography to mean clusters or patterns of some of the most iconic representations of our times, then do these clusters or patterns convey to us any symbolic meaning? Symbolic meaning is, as opposed to real, something which talks about the deeper layers of the psyche. So if we have a dream, which I'm sure most of us have had experienced in our lives, then the contents of the dream or the form of the dream does signify something. And there is general consensus between laymen and experts in psychoanalysis and among religious philosophers, theologians for the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, that dreams do symbolize something, but everybody is clueless about what they exactly symbolize or signify. So dreams do not have real meanings. We can't just simply translate dreams into waking life correlates. We have to study dreams in association with, or our dreams in association with our other dreams and the dreams that are visited upon the members of our extended society. So that is the symbolic meaning as opposed to real meaning. Can we modify the previous question and now ask ourselves, if we take the railway iconography to mean clusters or patterns of some of the most iconic railway representations of our times, then do these clusters or patterns convey to us any symbolic meaning for the future? In other words, the image that you see on your right-hand side, is this conveying a real image to us or a symbolic image? And if your answer is the latter, because I'm sure you will all agree that although Mulberry has a very, very real place in our hearts, especially those of us who grew up post 1970s or post 1980s India, because we had the privilege of also viewing the television series on Doordarshan, then we will agree that the railway station and all its semiotics, all its signs and memories do occupy very symbolic meanings for us as well. Now that we can visualize the fictional railway station as the Arasulu station in Karnataka, since the Indian Railways has dedicated that site as part of its Malguri Museum project to R.K. Narayan. So despite having a very real life correlate, the station still occupies a great symbolic place in our hearts and our minds. So the background essentially is this. Carl Jung, if you look at the excerpt in the middle of the page, used to say that what happens successively in our lives, in our recorded history, what we witness in 2020 and then in 2021 and then in 2022 might appear as unfolding in successive years in our recorded history, but in the mind of God. And Carl Jung was not really a religious person. So what he means by God here is a tongue-in-cheek metaphor for the collective unconscious. So in the eyes of God or in the mind of God, it all happens in simultaneity. It's a constant, it's a big accumulation of events and moments, and one can't really distinguish between one and the other. In the mind of God, that is, or in the mind of the collective unconscious. Look at the first excerpt on the top of the page. This is from the Great Indian Railways, which is the second book on the railways that I wrote, or rather the upgraded version of The Purveyors of Destiny. It says that long years before the idiomatic tryst, which was a tryst at midnight, this is what happened. It was a public holiday. At 3:30 p.m., as the 21 guns rode together, the first train carrying Lady Falkland, wife of Governor of Bombay, along with 400 special invitees, steamed off. This happened in Bombay in 1853, and we all know what unfolded 96 years later in the north of India and the east of India during the 1940s, the events following, preceding and following 15th of August 1947. And this is James Hollis at the bottom of the page, who tells us that we ought to respect our dreams. And when he says dreams, he doesn't simply mean the dreams that we witness as part of the REM sleep cycle, but also dreams in a larger sense. We ought to respect symbolic meanings because nature doesn't waste energy. Now, I'd like to issue a healthy warning here. So some of the arguments and the hypotheses in this presentation, this is a work in progress, by the way, meant for an academic seminar and then an academic paper. So some of the hypotheses may tend to look like or seem like or sound like horoscopic predictions. And although some of the foundational concepts are similar, in no way do I mean to endorse or disrespect, whichever way you'd like to look at it, horoscopic predictions or astrology or the art of predictions in general. I personally do not predict things. I don't like predicting things, but for those who do, this is not to endorse or disrespect anyone's leanings. Nonetheless, what this presentation is now eventually going to do is take Carl Jung as that key figure and use his concepts in order to study correlations in the past and what we can predict, if at all, on the basis of those correlations in the future. So to explain archetypes, because this is what we will need tremendously in this presentation, archetypes are some symbolic figures or symbolic themes or key concepts that our minds can conceive. And this doesn't require a great deal of training. Since childhood, we have the ability, as it were, from the traces of social, atavistic and other forms of evolutionary mechanisms, as it were, we have the traces in our minds to identify people or characters or subjects as rulers, caregivers, creators, sages, explorers, wizards, jesters, heroes, and so on and so on. So these are some of the key archetypes that each of us carry, some of the key traces of identifying and classifying the people in our lives, or the people we see on screens, on celluloid screens, or read about in the books, or see in public life. However, this is only a very lay representation. You will find such classifications of archetypes all over the internet. So this is just one of those, and this is not really used for clinical purposes. A psychoanalyst or a doctor will certainly not endorse this kind of a very simplistic demonstration of what archetypes are. But nonetheless, it's helpful for our understanding what the human mind does to the external world by means of these archetypes. So what is an archetype? If the previous slide is only a very lay representation, can we have a slightly more serious representation or definition? Well, the definition, if I take it in Carl Jung's own words, sounds a little complex, but it is really not so. Carl Jung or his colleague, Marie-Louise von Franz, defined archetypes as primordial images or patterns of emotional or mental behavior or unconscious forms, which are devoid of any specific content. In other words, if we look at the previous slide and see the archetype of the ruler, then the dress and the stick and the hairstyle and the jewels of the ruler are really not very important. What is important is that our mind constructs the function of a ruler. So the form and content are not expressly important in the archetype of the ruler, but it's just that our mind constructs a ruler out of this image. So they are essentially devoid of any specific content, and they are irrepresentable structures that always and everywhere on suitable occasions produce similar thoughts, mythological images, feelings, and emotions in human beings, parallel to the instincts. Carl Jung gave a slightly more sophisticated definition of it. He called archetypes organs of the pre-rational psyche. So when we look at archetypes, or when our mind creates archetypes out of nature, out of external reality, as it were, then our mind doesn't look for rationality. Essentially, our mind is not only empirical and logical, but also deeply irrational and supra-rational at times. So archetype belongs within in that gray area between supra-rationality and perhaps even irrationality. So common tropes referred to as archetypes, and once again, you will find this all over the internet. These archetypes, some of the examples are that of the trickster, the shadow, the anima, the animus, the mandala, the sage, the antichrist, and so on. But these examples might mislead us to think that archetypes are personas or objects, but that is not so. Archetypes are some of the simplified typologies that our minds create in classifying nature and external reality. So they need not be a person or a human being or a human persona. It could be other things as well. And as we shall observe in the case of the railways, they happen to be not just human personas, but also institutions and bigger, spaces. So what's in the mind? Why are we talking about the mind when we talk about the railways? Why am I getting this very privileged platform to speak about the mind in the first place? Well, it's not really a big leap from the mind of the engine to the mind of the spectator, as it were, because since the 19th century, a lot of stress has been laid on how the human mind perceives the railways and how the human mind perceives the relationship between railways and civil society and its own relationship with the civil society. Also, the advent of the railways has created great shifts in aesthetic perception and the aesthetics of various kind of artistic representations, whether that is in photography, in the arts, painting, sculpture, poetry, and even scholarly writings, because each of these areas has been affected by railway technology and railway architecture. So this is Wolfgang Skevelbusch, who wrote the very eminent book called The Railway Journey. It's a history, a cultural history of what railways did to Europe since the 19th century. And one of the first big impacts that the railways had on human psychology was that the human mind, or the European mind, the enlightened mind, as it is known, got accustomed to what we call the panoramic perception. So it became from being a tool of kings and monarchs, it became an activity of our daily lives, of the lay person, to witness panoramic sights. And this created a massive shift in the psychology of human beings who were once upon a time endangered by their external realities. They used to consider themselves very small, but then all of that dissolved into a deeper psychic layer, and one started feeling more and more secure in the railways. And the railways started opening up the way for new activities, such as reading a newspaper, such as chatting with your friends, such as reading a book, such as eating. And railways have been in many cultures, also in India, definitely, the stages for experimenting with cuisine and design and form and architecture, and it continues to be so. Now, one of the archetypes that I thought of presenting before you, just so I can exemplify what archetypes are once again, and just so you can also try in your minds to create these archetypes. Now, these are two images that I took from Satyajit Ray's iconic films, Pother Panchali and Aparajito. And the homesick migrant is my personal archetype for one of the characters that I talk about in The Great Indian Railways, and that happens to be one of my granduncles. Of course, this is a story or a legend that I've heard from family members, and it could, for all you know, it could be entirely false. But it is helpful for me to exemplify what an archetype is. And this man, whom of course I've seen, and I haven't heard the story from him. He is no more, but his posterity has told me the story several times. And he used to visit the Howrah station. He was from Banaras. He had come to Calcutta on a job posting, and he used to visit the Howrah station just to have a glimpse of trains coming from Banaras, because he was so homesick. Although he was a Bengali, Calcutta was not his hometown, or at least he did not consider it so. And on days when the train was late and he had to return to his office, he would go back deeply morose and empty-handed. But when the train was on schedule, he went back to his clerical desk with a spring in his step and his stiffened career. So this is the archetype of the homesick migrant, which the railways, on the one hand, support, and on the other hand, it's in some ways the railways themselves that have created this archetype of, or this population of homesick migrants. So the railways are playing a dual role here. But these are, of course, as I've been going on about some of the personal aspects, what we make of the railways on an individual level. But do we see the bigger picture? As Ian Jaker said, the railways were built to signify something, and they were built by the British and then rebuilt by the Indians and reinvented by the Indians. But what did they signify? If we take the railways in the 19th century, or in a specific frame within perhaps 1845 and 1875 or 1880, the answer is somewhat simpler, because that was the India of Kipling, and it was represented textually to the railway traveler who sat in a carriage moving through the subcontinent's landscape, and he or she was privy to this panoramic gaze through the carriage window, where India was seen, represented, and imagined and written about in almost simultaneous fashion. So as people traveled in the trains, people started started seeing India, or the new imagined geography of India, unfolding and forming in front of their eyes. But if we look at the previous excerpt, which is this, it conveys an image to us. It conveys the image of a human persona. Now, it is usually said that a picture speaks 1,000 words, but is it possible that a picture also hides several thousand words? In other words, what we see, is that really the entirety of reality, or is there something much deeper beneath it, much deeper that we cannot always articulate? Look at this image. There's another set of very iconic motifs that each of us, whether as photographers, whether as cartographers, whether as scholars, poets, enthusiasts, we all in some way secretly love or secretly cherish. This comes from a film, Kabhi Ha Kabhi Na, which was released in 1994 as part of its song Deewana Dil Deewana, and Shah Rukh Khan, who's waiting for his beloved woman Suchitra Krishnamurti. These are the names of the actors who played various characters in that. Tells one of his friends what is possibly happening on the Konkan Railway, or Shah Rukh Khan is giving us an imaginative landscape of the sights and the scenes that Suchitra Krishnamurti is experiencing from her railway carriage, from a window seat. And he says, I will not read the Hindi portion, I'll read my translation. He says, a train is darting across the jungles. A girl looks out the window, trees caught in waltz, a flock of birds takes flight, a tunnel through the mountains, the engine whistling incessantly. These are symbols that photographers, I would think, in my humble view, we can have Mr. Bahadur confirm or deny, but in my humble view, I would think these are symbols that photographers would really wait for, that rail fanners would really wait for. And why so? Has somebody told them? Has Shah Rukh Khan or Majroor Sultan Puri come and told them that you've got to look out for these symbols? Or if I ask Carl Jung, he would tell me that these are the primordial images that we unconsciously look for in a big panoramic representation, especially when we are talking about an institution like the railways. So this is what Shah Rukh Khan was trying to convey to us. On the top left is Suchitra Krishnamurti. She's traveling on the Konkan Railways, but I'd be very happy to be disabused. It can be any other part of India as well, but I think it is the Malabar regions. And on the bottom right is a tunnel. So what do these images convey to us? I would be very happy if you kept noting things down, your very simple observations, and it's those crucial little details that we are looking for. And eventually, with a cluster of these icons, I hope we will be building towards a thesis. We see something not very different happening in this set of slides as well. Although we have nothing of the scenery, we have nothing of the quote-unquote external reality, as it were. We have the human characters and the actors playing them. This is Sharmila Tagore, and on the left-hand side, and Rajesh Khanna on the right, from the film Aradhana. And this is also shot on, or representing the DHR, Darjeeling Himalayan Railways. And although we do not have the sights of mountains and tunnels here, not at least in these slides, this slide also represents something very similar, because the lyrics of the song go like, Mere Sapno Ki Rani, or the Queen of My Dreams. So who is the Queen of My Dreams? Is it the actress? Is it the actor? Is it the engine? Is it the engine, the locomotive driver? Or is it something deeper? And why did I say that this slide is not very different than this slide? I'll come to that answer in a little bit. And This is, again, on the right-hand side, we have Rishi Kapoor and Padmini Kolhapuri shot on the, or at least representing the Nilgiri Railways. I think the name of the film is Humse Hai Zamana or Zamane Ko Dikhana Hai, one of those two, and it was filmed in 1981, and it's from a song Hoga Tumse Pyara Kaun, Humko To Tumse Hai Pyar. And this slide again is, I would argue, a continuation of this very aesthetic of placing the viewer at the helm of a panoramic view. So in order to understand what these pictures are trying to convey consciously or unconsciously, and I'm leaving it slightly hanging at the moment, but I'll pull all the threads together. As we have, once we have seen the history of the aesthetics of representation in the Indian Railways, so I'll bring back all these slides once again, but for now, let's take a detour into how the history was, the history of representing this iconography. Now, as part of the early iconographic ambitions, we have multiple commentators and observers and critics in the 19th century. One of them was Hyde Clark, who was a very eminent economist and who was perhaps one of the first people to promulgate the idea of India as a marketplace, thanks to a marketplace for English goods, thanks to the Indian Railways. And he was writing throughout the decade of the 1840s. And in each of his pamphlets and treatises, he was focusing on the utilitarian ethic that of the railways bringing in the good of the greatest number of people and being a very, very efficient marketplace for English goods in India. There were people like Edwin Arnold, who wanted to focus more on the political and the social aspects of the railways, and he argued that the railways would wound India together as one nation. And then there were people like this gentleman, S. McBean, who had even bigger ambitions, who wanted to join London to India through a railway channel, passing through Constantinople, Asia Minor, and this was done obviously to stave off Muscovite threats or threats of a Russian invasion. So England was, or Britain was, in competition with Russia during this time to build the biggest imperial railway network. And although that line from London to Peking never really materialized, the British, by the end of the First World War, by the beginning of the First World War, left ample, a huge testimony of the experiments that they were doing in the 19th century, especially in the late 19th century. Remember those 100 million pounds that were spent by 1875. By the end of 19th century, the number had trebled. So we have about 25,000 kilometers of trackage, which, as if Samit Chaudhary, Roy Chaudhary's estimates from yesterday are to be believed, I think they would be roughly twice the circumference of the Earth, so twice the expanse of the equator. 25,000 kilometers by the end of 1910 is what we have in the history of the Indian Railways. So the line from London to Peking was not materialized, but these ambitions were anything but stupid. And the fact that historians were giving voice to these ambitions was also testimony to what the collective unconscious was telling us about the direction that the railways were going to take. Now, this is another very iconic representation, and multiple such representations can be found in 19th century periodicals. This is the opening of the Madras Railway from the Illustrated London News of 1856. And the previous station was called the Royapuram station. But instead of the railways being the highlight here, we have really the insignia, the grandeur of the audience, which and these Doric pillars and a very different kind of architecture. And it's difficult for us to actually reconcile ourselves to the fact that this is in India. Whereas to my mind, to my view, this really isn't, at least from, from my senses, it doesn't seem very Indian. So beside the social, political, cultural, and architectural impetus that was given to various kinds of railway ambitions and aesthetics, there was also this elevation of the English language itself, because everything had to be communicated in the English language, everything had to be understood in the English language, and the railways and India, as it were, had to be imagined in the English language. This was proposed by none other than Indians themselves writing in the English language. So one of them was Babu Ram Gopal Ghosh. I'm obviously taking only one example here, but there are multiple such. Babu Ram Gopal Ghosh was a colleague of Dwarkanath Tagore, and Dwarkanath Tagore was himself one of the proponents of all the things that I've been talking about, including the English language. So they wanted to undermine native prejudice by successfully importing the civilizing influence of steam and the civilizing influence of the English language. And the same was the opinion of Madhav Rao, who acted as the Diwan of the princely states of Travancore, Indore, and Baroda. Okay, audience, you'll have to excuse me for one moment. There's somebody at the door. Just excuse me for one moment, please. I'm so sorry. Mr. Singh, am I audible to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, you are.
Okay,
You are.
okay.
You are.
Thank you. So I realize I have taken a lot of my time for today's talk, so I'll be a little brief.
In fact, we only have 6 minutes left.
Is that really so? Okay.
Okay, we can stretch it to 7-8 minutes, but certainly not more than that.
All
Maybe
right.
10.
Fair enough. So let's come to the archetype then. So all that construction and all that representation in the 19th century throws up this archetype, that is of the imperial bioscope. I will discuss what are the implications of this archetype. So if I am a 19th century observer in the 19th century and looking at 19th century records, I will obviously not be able to understand the complete set of implications that this archetype has, that of the imperial bioscope. But perhaps if I was observing it in 1947, I'll have a better chance of understanding what this was signifying in 1900. In the first half of the 20th century, what we have is a different aesthetic, or a step up from the previous aesthetic, that the railways were beginning to, railway stations were beginning to be designed as theaters or amphitheaters. Now, this is on the right-hand side bottom is the Flinders Station in Melbourne, and on the right-hand side top is St. Pancras International in London, and on the left is the Victoria Terminus. So these are supposed to be the sister stations of Empire. They were built out of similar models of Gothic architecture. And this was in some ways Indianized by M.K. Gandhi. And he converted these settings into his third class, and third class is within quotes here, anti-colonial amphitheater. So I will not go into the text as much as the images because I have so little time left. So if we look at some of the iconic representations from the 1920s and 1930s, we find how the railway stations have got converted as anti-colonial theaters or amphitheaters. And in some ways, this kind of a theatrical resurgence, anti-colonial resurgence is also symbolizing something much deeper in the Indian psyche. On the left-hand side, that is Gandhiji. On the right-hand side, that is the Asthi special carrying the last remains of Gandhiji in 1948. So there was a secret potential that that the formation of this archetype was fueled by, and that secret potential I will not really go into, but along with the positive energy of the anti-colonial struggle, there were also some deeper hidden energies which we were not able to take account of. And eventually, the railways between 1905 and 1950 began operating as an anti-colonial, and one can also call it a Swadeshi theater. So the implications of this were available to us much later, much after the events of 1947. This is study number 3, and here I'll focus a lot more on cinema. So this is Satyajit Ray's Sonar Kela, an article that I wrote on that film. And it talks about how Sonar Kela is, or its railway sequences are about burying the ghosts of the past, because it's an exercise in time travel. The train in Sonar Kela takes us to a time that was, or perhaps never was, and it's a kind of a catharsis from the point of view of the central character, that is Mukul, who is supposed to be a Jatishwar, somebody who's twice born. And Satyajit Ray's cinema has also inspired Wes Anderson, and Anderson in his film Darjeeling Limited also does pretty much the same thing. He takes his characters on a spiritual journey to India, to a geographical past, as it were, which perhaps never was. So there you see on top of the screen a photograph of Satyajit Ray. And these are the 3 characters, the 3 brothers in Wes Anderson's Darjeeling Limited. This is a snapshot of Uttam Kumar playing the central character in the film Nayak, 1969. And this is a journey into the mind of the character. So from traversing geographies, Satyajit Ray is also using the railways to traverse into the human psychology. And once we come to the 1990s, we find the motif of traveling across geographies, traveling through human psychology, being very directly and unabashedly getting converted to being a motif that promotes tourism. So on the top of the screen is Kajol with her friends. The bottom of the screen is Shah Rukh Khan with his friends in the film Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, in Switzerland, or going to Switzerland. And on the left-hand side top and on the right-hand bottom are Amrish Puri and Kajol, respectively, in India. So they are, on the one hand, showcasing Europe to Indian eyes and India to European eyes. And these are some very iconic scenes from Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, and they signify a lot of things for a lot of people, but what they very importantly signify to my mind are is the answer to this question: where are the 2 passengers bound for? So it's important for us to answer this. Where are they going? They're obviously going to Europe, and that is where perhaps the train is also going, because that's where the train will return from and bring in a great deal of eminence, wealth, influence, and so on. So Indianhood was performed largely during this era, and some of the figures, the government's own figures of the tourism share in the world tell us how tourism shot up since 2000. So that is just 5 years after Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge. I could name multiple other films which were having a deep impact on tourist psychology. And from 2.54 international tourist arrivals, we are looking at about 18 million international tourist arrivals every year today. So railway archetypes of from 1950s to 1999, condensed in the archetype of the tourist guide. And it is only today that we can see the total implications of that archetype. So I'll be very brief in my final archetype. I suppose I have less than a minute. So this is what
we can give you 3 or 4 minutes.
This is what we are looking at currently. This is on the left-hand side, there's Rani Mukherjee and Vivek Oberoi from the film Satya 2002. On the right, this is Priyanka Chopra and Ranbir Kapoor from the film Biography 2012. This is Toilet, a Prem Katha, Ek Prem Katha from 2015, Akshay Kumar and Bhumi Pednekar. And another very interesting film, which has some railway sequences called Masan. I'd like to read this little excerpt here. So the character on the right tells the character on the left about an imaginary character called Mukherjee Sahib. Okay, and this is situated in central India. So the woman is the daughter of a poor father, and she's trying to make ends meet for her father and her very small nuclear family. And the person on the right, we know very little about him. He's a railway ticket clerk. And he tells her, look what wonderful book the railways have published. A time is gone when we had to slog without books. See this? And he shows a photograph. This is Mukherjee Sahib. He was a ticket clerk before you. He point blank refused to learn computer. Railways shunted him to Dungarpur, Rajasthan. He must be still punching manual tickets there. By the way, you must be knowing very good computer, no? And she says, yes. So the railway iconography of this time is definitely signaling a big change, a very steady but big change. And this is where the character, the woman goes away from her father. She is going to study in Allahabad University. And this is a snapshot from a film called Raat Akeli Hai, which released in 2020. So this is the final scene where the male character comes to meet the female character, a very strong-willed, independent woman. And she has survived her life through various kinds of struggles and scandals. And she has also brought about a big positive change in the mind of this police inspector. And in the final scene, while he proposes marriage to her, proposes a new home to her, it's almost as if it is she who has brought about this change in his mind, and a lot of his previous prejudices and rigidities are gone. So this is what we have in this unfinished, this unfinished jubilee, and it's not, if you forgive the typographical error, it's not 1950, it's 2050. So some of the recurrent archetypal patterns we can observe from these representations are small town assertions, nuclear families in transition, and women coming of age. So these patterns condense in the archetypes of social, gender, and family norms reformer. So this is what, to my mind, the archetypes are suggesting, being the role of the railways in this age, if I take the iconography and read them like Carl Jung would have read them. So what if India's railway iconography was studied like symbols in a dream? This, in a nutshell, is what they signify. The imperial bioscope, that archetype signified Kipling's phenomena, colonial stereotypes, a shared Anglo-Indian heritage, and a historically bittersweet relationship. The anti-colonial theater signified post-colonial assertion, provincial independence tryst with destiny, and the events of 1947. And my argument here is that if we had studied that archetype well enough, then we would have been perhaps aware of what was to unfold. Tourist guide between 1950s and 1999. So it signified, or it was prophesying, India's neoliberal economy and culture, and India's growing prominence in the diaspora. And social reformer. I suppose if we study this today well enough, and if we acquire more data on the iconography and study the archetype more seriously, then we will be able to get more details about what these social challenges really are. I will not go into them in a great depth today. But how and when or what kind of reforms in social psychology are we looking at? And what are the challenges for the nuclear family? And what is upward causation in women's empowerment going to look like? So by upward causation, I mean something that comes from.
Arup, your time is more than over. If you can finish in about a minute or so.
Very well then. So this is finally the Jungian hypothesis. It is obviously easy to mistake a correlation as a causation, but if we study India's railway spaces as microcosmic configuration of Indian society and landmass, they reflect very deep psychological shifts in the Indian mind, and studying them can definitely unveil new possibilities of historic transformations in the future. And I would hope that we stay prepared rather than meet these changes unprepared. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arup.
Yes.
It was a presentation that certainly makes you think and think a little more differently from what we normally think. And please pardon me if I'm stopping you without going into details, because time is certainly running short. Since we don't have much time for questions, I'll only ask you one question that has been asked by Vikas Singh. Vikas Singh says, railway station as amphitheater, a very interesting way of looking at railway stations. Can you elaborate?
In the 19th century, you see, I shared the design of St. Pancras railway station. Now, I think if we take on the level of architectural discourses, we can very easily see the impact of different kinds of architectural models of whether those are railway stations in Britain or Australia or other parts of the dominions, how they shaped and influenced the architecture of various railway stations in India. So that is one way of studying railway stations as amphitheaters. But when I say amphitheater or anti-colonial amphitheater, I have something very specific in mind. I have the Satyagraha movements of the early 20th century in mind. I've got the Rail Roko Andolan of colonial times as well as post-colonial times in mind. I've got the railway stations as a precursor to social media in my mind, because what happens in social media today is definitely a reflection of Indian society or society of that particular nationality. But to my mind, before the arrival of social media, the Indian railways and its railway platforms were the stages for various amphitheatrical performances, whether by the state, the colonial state as it were, or by the anti-colonial satyagrahis. So that is what I meant by amphitheater. If you have something to add to that, I'd be happy to hear.
Anything to say, Vikas?
No, that's a very interesting observation. Looking at a railway station or a platform as an amphitheater and those archetypes. I would just like to ask one quick question, Arup, and then we can move to the next one, because you talked a lot about archetypes. If you look at the steam locomotives and that era, can we look at the steam locomotives as a more masculine culture? Because many a times a steam loco has a very phallic connection. And that's the way it's been described in a lot of books. What's your take on that?
I don't suppose I do that, or I would like to endorse actively such a point of view. But I obviously can't deny anybody their right. I would say that as opposed to being gendered, as opposed to identifying a particular gender in the steam and what you call the phallic symbol, I would rather say it was a spectacularization of the external reality or something that was external phenomena, whereas the railway compartment also has an inner space. And that inner space is equally important to people, to passengers, and also to photographers and all kinds of artists, architects, and engineers. So that was a spectacularization of the external space. And yes, that is an archetype. Phallic symbols, I'm afraid, are more in tune with Freudian psychology, which I am not so much a pursuant of. I follow Jungian psychology. But yes, you're absolutely right. Many historians have seen an example of the masculinity of the colonial era and the earlier, post-colonial Indian era. But I would think that is more to do with how design and architecture was focusing on the external realities. Whereas today we are talking about, see, in my archetypes, I'm talking about the nuclear family and women's empowerment, right? And this is not something that we have to do, quote unquote. This is something that is happening from the grassroots level, and we can't help it. I would hope that we all welcome it like I do, but this will happen whether we like it or not. So I think that the inner shift from the mind of the engine and the steam to the mind of the passenger within, I think has more to do with Jungian archetypes than Freudian psychology.
Very interesting.
One of the interesting observations I would like to make is that, especially in the steam days, the locomotive was always referred to in the feminine, as a feminine, she. All locomotive drivers and locomotive pilots, etc., refer to as the steam locomotive as a she. That is not so that obvious with the diesel and electric locomotives we have today. The steam locomotive only was referred to as a she. I wonder what that means.
No, this is what I was also trying to say, because I don't agree, which is why I don't agree with the phallic symbolization of steam engines, because I think there's an androgynous element to they signify both genders or multiple genders, I would say.
Anyway, there are a few more questions, but due to shortage of time, we'll probably have to stop here now. Thank you very much, Arup.
Thank you.
As I said, you've given us a totally different perspective to looking at the railways and their impact. We especially as railwaymen, think of the railways as a means of transportation, but I think they were far more than that. Thank you very much for your very different take on the railways.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Namaste, everybody.
Namaste.